Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you are having a wonderful morning or afternoon. Actually, it is afternoon already. Oh my goodness. You guys, where does time go? It just flies. Welcome. Ooh, music's a little loud. Welcome to yet another live read with the Chattering Magpie. I hope you're having a good day. And today I'm excited because we are starting at last Jane Eyre. And I know like it was between two books, Persuasion and Jane Eyre. Persuasion being the smaller book, the shorter book. And so I went with the one that I like the most, to tell you the truth. Well, actually both books are really good. Both books are excellent, but I just have a fondness for Jane Eyre, and so I just went that way. I will read Persuasion, so don't you worry, I will not forget it. So let me just go and say hi to the early gang. Hello, gang. How are you? Crusher was the very first one. Crusher, you crushed it. You became the very first person to comment. And I know I scheduled this a little bit later than I usually do. Usually I do wait 8 hours before I'm gonna go live. I say hey, we're gonna go live, but I wasn't even sure we were gonna be able to have a live. Just between work and my other channel and doing the things, I was like, yo, I'm trying. So I'm just so glad that you guys are with me, and thank you for being here at the chat. So Crusher, thank you for being the first one. And Little Butterfly, hello, thank you for being here as well. And Red Tempest says, just listening in due to being at work. No worries. Just knowing that you're there and everybody here is just here, the gang, I can feel your presence. I don't know, that's kind of creepy. Forget that X that. Oh man, sometimes being live is really embarrassing. No, I just feel the support from the chat, so thank you for being here. And so okay, so Little Butterfly, oh no, wait, hold, before that, Noodle Something's Kimchi, hey, says hello, bookworms, hello. And Little Butterfly says, I know the basic outline of this book, but I have never really gotten into the story. We will see whether my thoughts will change. Yes, so it's a classic, but of course, classic can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For example, this Charles Dickens is also a classic writer. Everybody seems to agree that his stories are good, and I agree, the stories are good. But you cannot make me read one of his books without having to take breaks or reading it alongside Cliff's notes or something. That's how I got through college and high school, reading Charles Dickens. I had to read all of these literature books. So that was the only way I could do it, because his prose just didn't really stir me. You had to wade through a lot of stuff, a lot of characters, very whimsical and very interesting characters. But it was hard. So in the same way, probably some people might find the prose in this one a little bit not as modern as one would wish. But I think that I actually found this book. I read it when I was 15, I think. Yeah, I was 15 years old. And I was devouring every book I could get, but this one just kind of stopped me in my tracks. And just because I had never read something like it before. I had watched the movie, the 1996 adaptation, but I was like, I didn't feel it. It didn't really speak to me. So later on, I picked up the book, and it was a different story. So I actually saw the movie first, didn't quite strike me as interesting, then read the book, and I was like, this is one of my favorites forever. And yeah, it still remains one of my favorite books. Okay, so yeah, I hope you are able to enjoy it. If not, you can just wait for us to do a watch party over on over on Discord. I do plan on watching this with people just because I love historicals, so one day we will do that. Okay, so Red Tempest, hello. All right, so you guys, I am so ready to get started with the book, but before I do, I like to kind of put it into context. So Jane Eyre was written by Charlotte Bronte, an English writer. She was, I forget what year she was born in, but the book was published in 1847. So it's a while. So you get this. You have to imagine yourself back in those times, like Victorian era. Like this is Victorian with a capital V. You got men in top hats and I don't know, women wearing bonnets and very strict societal values, and so this is where this book comes from. It's the writer was the daughter of an impoverished cleric, or like he was like a parson. He had a parsonage somewhere in Yorkshire, which is a very beautiful place, but it can also be very stark. So she and her fellow siblings, since the family wasn't rich at all, they had to amuse themselves with whatever way they could. And they all like wrote poems, did little plays. So they had a very creative childhood. And so she and her sisters, of whom we have Anne Bronte, who wrote The Tenant of Thornfield Hall. I hope I said that right. And Emily Bronte, who wrote The Tempestuous Wuthering Heights. And she wrote more than just Jane Eyre, but Jane Eyre is, I think, in my personal opinion, my favorite of hers. And so she had a very limited existence, like she didn't travel much. When she did travel, she did go abroad to, I think it was Belgium, to become a teacher or something about education. And that is where she had some experiences that were outside of her little sphere where she'd always grown up. And those short experiences shaped her way of like writing or seeing the world, I suppose. And we can find some inspiration of at least one of the characters here in one of her trips in Europe. So yeah, I think that's all I should say, I guess. Maybe I should read the what's it called? Do I need to read the blurb? I think you have the blurb somewhere in the description, so I don't really need to talk about it. But basically, Jane Eyre. Jane is a young orphan, and she's a young orphan who has been left in the care of an aunt, and so she has basically all her needs taken care of. But her home, her aunt doesn't give her affection, and so Jane has to endure childhood cruelty, like loneliness, cruelty. Her troubled childhood strengthens her natural independence and spirit, and which proved necessary when she finds employment as a governess to the ward of Mr Rochester. And so it is when she went out to work as a governess that she got to know Mr Rochester, and she also got to learn about the secrets of Thornfield Hall. And so, you know, there's a terrible secret lurking about, and she has to make a choice. And so it's basically a story about following convictions, and it has intrigue and mystery. It's a gothic romance, I guess you could say. But it's basically like this depiction of a woman's search for equality and freedom. Now, keep in mind that this is coming from somebody who, in the Victorian era, women had very limited means of making money for themselves, of being independent. So this is how she kind of like Charlotte Bronte kind of railed against that. Mariah from Sound of Music, yeah, except that in this case, Red Tempest, in this case, it was only one child. So all of the rest about the father and all the things, I will let you learn about that for sure. I guess you could say it's Sound of Music, but make it gothic. You know, a little bit of mystery, a little bit of intrigue. Again, It was kind of like groundbreaking. This book was groundbreaking for its time when it came out. So, all right, everybody. I think I've gone through the things that we need to talk about. It's high time that we read, you guys. Let's get this. If you have the book, you can follow along or you can follow on the screen. As always, I will have it for you guys to enjoy. So let's do this. Let's read. Why am I going to say A Sense of Welcome? Let's read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering, indeed, in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning, but since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early. The cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so sombre and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight with nipped fingers and toes, and a heart saddened by the chidings of Bessie, the nurse, and humbled by the consciousness of my physical inferiority to Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. That said, Eliza, John, and Georgiana were now clustered round their mamma in the drawing room. She lay reclined on a sofa by the fireside, and with her darlings about her, for the time neither quarrelling nor crying, looked perfectly happy. Me she had dispensed from joining the group, saying she regretted to be under the necessity of keeping me at a distance, but that until she heard from Bessie, and could discover by her own observation that I was endeavouring in good earnest to acquire a more sociable and childlike disposition, a more attractive and sprightly manner, something lighter, franker, more natural, as it were, she really must exclude me from privileges intended only for contented, happy little children. What does Bessie say I have done? I asked. Jane, I don't like cavaliers or questioners. Besides, there's something truly forbidding in a child taking up her elders in that manner. Be seated somewhere, and until you can speak pleasantly, remain silent. A breakfast room adjoined the drawing room. I slipped in there. It contained a bookcase. I soon possessed myself of a volume, taking care that it should be one stored with pictures. I mounted into the window seat. Gathering up my feet, I sat cross-legged like a Turk, and having drawn the red moreen curtain nearly close, I was shrined in double retirement. Folds of scarlet drapery shut in my view to the right hand. To the left were the clear panes of glass, protecting but not separating me from the drear November day. At intervals, while turning over the leaves of my book, I studied the aspect of that winter afternoon. Afar it offered a pale blank of mist and cloud, near a scene of wet lawn and storm-beat shrub, with ceaseless rain sweeping away wildly before a long and lamentable blast. I returned to my book, Bewick's History of British Birds. The letterpress thereof I cared little for, generally speaking, and yet there were certain introductory pages that, child as I was, I could not pass quite as blank. They were those which treat of the haunts of sea-fowl, of the solitary rocks and promontories, by them only inhabited, of the coast of Norway studded with isles from its southern extremity, the Lindenis or Naze of the North Cape, where the northern ocean in vast whirls boils round the naked melancholy isles of furthest Thule, and the Atlantic surge pours in among the stormy Hebrides. Nor could I pass unnoticed the suggestion of the bleak shores of Lapland, Siberia, Spitzbergen, Nova Zembla, Iceland, Greenland, with the vast sweep of the Arctic zone, and those forlorn regions of dreary space, that reservoir of frost and snow where firm fields of ice, the accumulation of centuries of winters, glazed in alpine heights above heights, surrounded the pole and concrete the multiplied rigors of extreme cold. Of these death-white realms, I formed formed an idea of my own, shadowy like all the half-comprehended notions that float dim through the children's brains, but strangely impressive. The words in these introductory pages connected themselves with the succeeding vignettes and gave significance to the rock standing up alone in a sea of billow and spray, to the broken boat stranded on a desolate coast, to the cold and ghastly moon glancing through bars of cloud at a wreck just sinking. I cannot tell what sentiment haunted the quite solitary churchyard, with its inscribed headstone, its gate, its 2 trees, its low horizon girdled by a broken wall, and its newly risen crescent, attesting the hour of eventide. The 2 ships becalmed on a torpid sea, I believed to be marine phantoms. The fiend pinning down the thief's pack behind him. I passed over it quickly. It was an object of terror. So was the black-horned thing seated aloof on a rock, surveying a distant crowd surrounding a gallows. Each picture told a story, mysterious often to my undeveloped understanding and imperfect feelings, yet ever profoundly interesting, as interesting as the tales Bessie sometimes narrated on winter evenings, when she chanced to be in good humor, and when, having brought her ironing table to the nursery hearth, she allowed us to sit about it. And while she got up Mrs. Reed's lace frills and crimped her nightcap borders, fed our eager attention with passages of love and adventure, taken from old fairy tales and other ballads, or as I later heard I discovered, from the passages of Pamela and Henry Earl of Morland. With Berwick on my knee, I was then happy at least in my way. I feared nothing but interruption, and that came too soon. The breakfast room door opened. "Bah! Madam Mope!" cried the voice of John Reed. Then he paused. He found the room apparently empty. "Where the dickens is she?" he continued. "Lizzie! Georgie!" calling to his sisters. "Joan is not here. Tell mamma she's run out into the rain. Bad animal!" It is well I drew the curtain, thought I, and I wished fervently he might not discover my hiding place, nor would John Reed have found it out himself. He was not quick either of vision or conception. But Eliza put her head in at the door and said at once, "She is in the window seat, to be sure, Jack." And I came out immediately, for I trembled at the idea of being dragged forth by the said Jack. "What do you want?" I asked with awkward diffidence. "Say, what do you want, Master Reed?" was the answer. "I want you to come here." And seating himself in an armchair, he intimated by a gesture that I was to approach and stand before him. John Reed was a schoolboy of 14 years old, 4 years older than I, for I was but 10, large and stout for his age, with a dingy and unwholesome skin, thick lineaments in a spacious visage, heavy limbs and large extremities. He gorged himself habitually at table, which made him bilious, and gave him a dim and bleared eye and flabby cheeks. He ought now to have been at school, though his mamma had taken him home for a month or 2, on account of his delicate health. Mr. Miles, the master, affirmed that he would do very well if he had fewer cakes and sweetmeats sent him from home. But the mother's heart turned from an opinion so harsh, and inclined rather to the more refined idea that John's sallowness was owing to over-application, and perhaps to pining after home. John had not much affection for his mother and sisters, and an antipathy to me. He bullied and punished me, not 2 or 3 times in the week, not once or twice in the day, but continually. Every nerve I had feared him, and every morsel of flesh in my bones shrank when he came near. There were moments when I was bewildered by the terror he inspired, because I had no appeal whatever against either his meanness or his inflictions. The servants did not like to offend their young master by taking my part against him, and Mrs. Reed was blind and deaf on the subject. She never saw him strike or heard him abuse me, though he did both now and then in her very presence. More frequently, however, behind her back. Habitually obedient to John, I came up to his chair. He spent some 3 minutes in thrusting out his tongue at me as far as he could without damaging the roots. I knew he would soon strike, and while dreading the blow, I mused on the disgusting and ugly appearance of him who would presently deal it. I wonder if he read that notion on my face, for, all at once, without speaking, he struck suddenly and strongly. I tottered, and on regaining my equilibrium, retired back a step or two from his chair. "That is for your impudence in answering mamma a while since," said he, "and for your sneaking way of getting behind curtains, and for the look you had in your eyes 2 minutes since, you rat." Accustomed to John Reed's abuse, I never had an idea of replying to it. My care was how to endure the blow which would certainly follow the insult. "What were you reading behind the curtain?" he asked. "Oh, sorry. What were you doing behind the curtain?" he asked. I was reading." "Show me the book." I returned to the window and fetched the dance. "You have no business to take our books. You're a dependent. Mamma says you have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg, not to live here with gentlemen's children like us, and eat the same meals we do, and wear the clothes at our mamma's expense. Now, I'll teach you to rummage my bookshelves, for they are mine. All the house belongs to me, or will do in a few years. Go and stand by the door, out of the way of the mirror and the windows." I did so, not at first aware what was his intention. But when I saw him lift and poise the book and stand in an act to hurl it, I instinctively started aside with a cry of alarm. Not soon enough, however. The volume was flung. It hit me, and I fell, striking my head against the door and cutting it. The cut bled. The pain was sharp. My terror had passed its climax. Other feelings succeeded. "Wicked and cruel boy," I said. "You are like a murderer. You are like a slave driver. You are like the Roman emperors." I had read Goldsmith's History of Rome and had formed my opinion of Nero, Caligula, etc. Also, I had drawn parallels in silence, which I never thought thus to have declared aloud. "What? What?" he cried. Did she say that to me? Did you hear her, Eliza, Georgiana? Won't I tell mamma? But first—" He ran headlong at me. I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. Felt a drop or two of blood from my head trickle down my neck, and was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations for the time predominated over fear, and I received him in frantic sort. I don't very well know what I did with my hands, but he called me "Rat! Rat!" and bellowed out aloud. Aid was near him. Eliza and Georgiana had run for Mrs. Reed, who was gone upstairs. She now came upon the scene, followed by Bessie and her maid Abbot. We were parted. I heard the words, "Dear, dear, what a fury to fly, Master John! Did ever anybody see such a picture of passion?" Then Mrs. Reed subjoined, "Take her away to the Red Room and lock her in there." 4 hands were immediately laid upon me, and I was borne upstairs. All right. Woof. So we have an introductory chapter. So we get 2 things here. First of all, we get a description of her life. We get how I think it's the moment that she absolutely snaps. It says that she had continually been, she continually received abuse from John, and she was actually terrified of him. She never really thought to disobey him. But it was at that moment, this is the moment when she just snaps and loses it, and she fights back. Never before had she fought back. This is the first time she fights back. And so she's going to reap the consequences of that. We'll see in a minute about what the Red Room is. But before we do, I just want to show you some of the pictures of the Jane Eyres from this around this time period. Some of the young children who played Jane Eyres during other adaptations. So let me see. Oops, wrong ones. Here we go. So this is from the latest, the 2011 version. This is Jane hiding in behind the curtain, and I think they did a really good job casting her too, and of course her bully. This is from the 2006 version. Again, it's Jane is hiding in the window seat. So you get the gist of like her age. This is the age where she finally loses it, I guess. Now, this is out of context, but okay, we'll explain later. what a screenshot out of context. This is from 1996's version. This is the very first version I watched. So yeah. And this is from the 1983 version. Jane reading in the window seat. All right, we'll go back to adaptations in a little while, but yeah, just so you guys have a visual idea of Jane at that time. I think it helps, at least when I was reading the books, because I had already watched the movie. I was able to follow along with in my head, like a movie was playing kind of deal. All right, so let's continue on. So far, John is an absolute bully, and it sucks that she is basically a dependent and nobody really is on her side. So her cousin started the fight, but she's going to be the only one to be punished for it. Poor Jane. All right. By the way, we're gonna be faced with a lot of Roman numerals again, so I hope that in time I struggle less. But this one I know. Chapter 2. Yeah, I hate John already. Yeah, John is awful. He's awful. Poor Jane. Yeah, she's. This is where she starts, and that's why her childhood is important, because it's part of her what formed her character and towards when she's an adult. So you'll see. Chapter 2. I resisted all the way, a new thing for me, and a circumstance which greatly strengthened the bad opinion of Bessie and Miss Abbott. The bad opinion Bessie and Miss Abbott were disposed to entertain of me. The fact is, I was a trifle beside myself, or rather out of myself, as the French would say. I was conscious that a moment's mutiny had already rendered me liable to strange penalties, and, like any other rebel slave, I felt resolved in my desperation to go all lengths. "Hold her arms, Miss Abbott! She's like a mad cat!" For shame! Cried the lady's maid. "What shocking conduct, Miss Eyre, to strike a young gentleman, your benefactress's son, your young master!" "Master? How is he my master? Am I a servant?" "No, you are less than a servant, for you do nothing for your keep. There, sit down and think over your wickedness." They had got me by this time into the apartment indicated by Mrs. Reed, and had thrust me upon a stool. My impulse was to rise from it like a spring. Their 2 pairs of hands arrested me instantly. "If you don't sit still, you must be tied down," said Bessie. "Miss Abbott, lend me your garters. She would break mine directly." Miss Abbott turned to divest a stout leg. Oh my goodness, I forgot about this detail. She was about to take off her garter to... Oh my goodness. Miss Abbott turned to divest a stout leg of the necessary ligature. This preparation of bonds and the additional ignominy it inferred took a little of the excitement out of me. "Don't take them off!" I cried. "I will not stir." In guarantee thereof, I attached myself to my seat by my hands. "Mind you don't," said Bessie, and when she had ascertained that I was really subsiding, she loosened her hold of me. Then she and Miss Abbott stood with folded arms, looking darkly and doubtfully on my face, as incredulous of my sanity. "She never did so before," at last said Bessie, turning to the Abigail. "But it was always in her," was the reply. "I've told Mrs. often my opinion about the child, and Mrs. agreed with me. She's an underhand little thing. I never saw a girl of her age with so much cover." Bessie answered not, but ere long, addressing me, she said, "You ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligation to Mrs. Reed. She keeps you. If she were to turn you off, you would have to go to the poorhouse." I had nothing to say to these words. They were not new to me. My very first recollections of existence included hints of the same kind. This reproach of my dependence had become a vague sing-song in my ear, very painful and crushing, but only half intelligible. Mrs. Abbott joined in. "And you ought not to think about, and you ought not to think yourself on an equality with the Mrs. Reed and Master Reed, because Mrs. Kindly allows you to be brought up with them. They will have a great deal of money, and you will have none. It is your place to be humble and to try to make yourself agreeable to them." "What we tell you is for your good," added Bessie in no harsh voice. "You should try to be useful and pleasant, then perhaps you would have a home here. But if you become passionate and rude, Mrs. will send you away, I am sure." "Besides," said Miss Abbott, "God will punish her. He might strike her dead in the midst of her tantrums, and where would she go? Come, Bessie, we will leave her. I wouldn't have her heart for anything. Say your prayers, Miss Eyre, when you are by yourself, for if you don't repent, something bad might be permitted to come down the chimney and fetch you away." They went, shutting the door and locking it behind them. The Red Room was a square chamber. Very seldom slept in. I might say never, indeed, unless when a chance of influx of visitors at Gateshead Hall rendered it necessary to turn to account all the accommodation it contained. Yet it was one of the largest and stateliest chambers in the mansion. A bed supported on massive pillars of mahogany, hung with curtains of deep red damask, stood out like a tabernacle in the center. The two large windows, with the blinds always drawn down, were half shrouded in festoons and falls of similar drapery. The carpet was red. The table at the foot of the bed was covered with a crimson cloth. The walls were a soft fawn color, with a blush of pink in it. The wardrobe, the toilet table, the chairs were of darkly polished old mahogany. Out of these deep surrounding shades rose high and glared white the piled-up mattresses and pillows of the bed, spread with a snowy Marseille counterpane. Scarcely less prominent was an ample cushioned easy chair near the head of the bed, also white, with a footstool before it, and looking, as I thought, like a pale throne. This room was chill, because it seldom had a fire. It was silent, because remote from the nursery and kitchen. Solemn, because it was known to be so seldom entered. The housemaid alone came here on Saturdays to wipe from the mirrors and the furniture a week's quiet dust, and Mrs. Reed herself, at far intervals, visited it to review the contents of a certain secret drawer in the wardrobe, where were stored divers parchments, her jewel casket, and a miniature of her deceased husband. And in those last words lies the secret of the Red Room, the spell which kept it so lonely in spite of its grandeur. Mr. Reed had been dead 9 years. It was in this chamber he breathed his last. Here he lay in state. Hence his coffin was borne by the undertaker's men, and since that day a sense of dreary consecration had guarded it from frequent intrusion. My seat, to which Bessie and the bitter Miss Abbott had left me riveted, was a low ottoman near the marble chimney-piece. The bed rose before me. To my right hand there was the high dark wardrobe, with subdued broken reflections varying the gloss of its panels. To my left were the muffled windows. A great looking-glass between them repeated the vacant majesty of the bed and the room. I was not quite sure whether they had locked the door, and when I dared move, I got up and went to see. Alas, yes, no jail was ever more secure. Returning, I had to cross before the looking-glass. My fascinated glance involuntarily explored the depth it revealed. All looked colder and darker in that visionary hollow than in reality. And the strange little figure there gazing at me, with a white face and arms specking the gloom, and glittering eyes of fear moving where all else was still, had the effect of a real spirit. I thought it like one of the tiny phantoms, half fairy, half imp. Bessie's evening stories represented as coming out of lone, ferny dells and moors, and appearing before the eyes of belated travelers. I returned to my stool. Superstition was with me at that moment, but it was not yet hour for complete victory. My blood was still warm. The mood of the revolted slave was still bracing me with its bitter vigor. I had to stem a rapid rush of retrospective thought before I quailed to the dismal present. All John Reed's violent tyrannies, all his sister's proud indifference, all his mother's aversion, all the servants' partiality, turned up in my disturbed mind like a dark deposit in a turbid well. Why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? Why could I never please? Why was it useless to try to win anyone's favor? Eliza, who was headstrong and selfish, was respected. Georgiana, who had a spoiled temper, a very acrid spite, a captious and insolent carriage, was universally indulged. Her beauty, her pink cheeks and golden curls seemed to give delight to all who looked at her, and to purchase indemnity for her every fault. John no one thwarted, much less punished, though he twisted the necks of the pigeons, killed the little pea-chicks, set the dogs at the sheep, and stripped the hothouse vines of their fruit, and broke the buds off the choicest plants in the conservatory. He called his mother old girl too, sometimes reviled her for her dark skin, similar to his own, bluntly disregarded her wishes, not unfrequently tore and spoiled her silk attire, and he was still her own darling. I dared commit no fault. I strove to fulfill every duty, and I was termed naughty and tiresome, sullen and sneaking, from morning to noon, and from noon to night. My head still ached and bled with the blow and fall I had received. No one had reproved John for wantonly striking me, and because I had turned against him to avert further irrational violence, I was loaded with general opprobrium. Unjust! Unjust! Said my reason, forced by the agonizing stimulus into precocious though transitory power, and resolve, equally wrought up, instigated some strange expedient to achieve escape from insupportable oppression, as running away, or, if that could not be effected, never eating or drinking more, and letting myself die. What a consternation of soul was mine that dreary afternoon! How all my brain was in tumult and my heart in insurrection! Yet in what darkness, what dense ignorance was the mental battle fought! I could not answer the ceaseless inward question, why I thus suffered. Now, at the distance of, I will not say how many years, I see it clearly. I was discord in Gateshead Hall. I was like nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed or her children or her chosen vassalage. If they did not love me, in fact, as little as I did love them, they were not bound to regard with affection a thing that could not sympathize with one amongst them, a heterogeneous thing, opposed to them in temperament, in capacity, in propensity, a useless thing, incapable of serving their interest or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing, cherishing the germs of indignation at their treatment, of contempt at their judgment. I know that had I been a sanguine, brilliant, careless, exacting, handsome, romping child, though equally dependent and friendless, Mrs. Reed would have endured my presence more complacently. Her children would have entertained for me more of the cordiality of fellow-feeling. The servants would have been less prone to make me the scapegoat of the nursery. Daylight began to forsake the Red Room. It was past 4 o'clock, and the beclouded afternoon was tending to drear twilight. I heard the rain still beating continuously on the staircase window, and the wind howling in the grove behind the hall. I grew by degrees cold as a stone, and then my courage sank. My habitual mood of humiliation self-doubt, forlorn depression fell damp on the embers of my decaying ire. All said I was wicked, and perhaps I might be so. What thought had I been but just conceiving of starving myself to death? That certainty was a crime. And was I fit to die? Or was the vault under the chancel of Gateshead Church an inviting bourne? In such vault, I had been told, did Mr. Reed lie buried, and led by this thought to recall his idea, I dwelt on it with gathering dread. I could not remember him, but I knew that he was my own uncle, my mother's brother, that he had taken me when a parentless infant to his house, and that in his last moments he had required a promise of Mrs. Reed that she would rear and maintain me as one of her own children. Mrs. Reed probably considered she had kept this promise, and so she had, I dare say, as well as her nature would permit her. But how could she really like an interloper not of her race and unconnected with her, after her husband's death, by any tie? It must have been most irksome to find herself bound by a hard-wrung pledge to stand in the stead of a parent to a strange child she could not love, and to see an uncongenial alien permanently intruded on her own family group. A singular notion dawned upon me. I doubted not, never doubted, that if Mr. Reed had been alive he would have treated me kindly. And now, as I sat looking at the white bed and overshadowed walls, occasionally also turning a fascinated eye towards the dimly gleaming mirror, I began to recall what I had heard of dead men, troubled in their graves by the violation of their last wishes, revisiting the earth to punish the perjured and avenge the oppressed. And I thought Mr. Reed's spirit, harassed by the wrongs of his sister's child, might quit its abode, whether in the church vault or in the unknown world of the departed, and rise before me in this chamber. I wiped my tears and hushed my sobs, fearful lest any sign of violent grief might waken a preternatural voice to comfort me, or elicit from the gloom some haloed face bending over me with strange pity. This idea, consolatory in theory, I felt would be terrible if realized. With all my might I endeavored to stifle it. I endeavored to be firm. Shaking my hair from my eyes, I lifted my head and tried to look boldly round this dark room. At this moment a light gleamed on the wall. Was it, I asked myself, a ray from the moon penetrating some aperture in the blind? No, moonlight was still, and this stirred. While I gazed, it glided up to the ceiling and quivered over my head. I can now conjecture readily that this streak of light was, in all likelihood, a gleam from a lantern carried by someone across the lawn. But then, prepared as my mind was for horror, shaken as my nerves were by agitation, I thought the swift darting beam was a herald of some coming vision from another world. My heart beat thick, my head grew hot, a sound filled my ears, which I deemed the rushing of wings. Something seemed near me. I was oppressed, suffocated. Endurance broke down. I rushed to the door and shook the lock in desperate effort. Steps came running along the outer passage. The key turned. Bessie and Abbot entered. "Miss Eyre, are you ill?" said Bessie. "What a dreadful noise! It went quite through me," exclaimed Abbot. "Let me out! Let me go out into the nursery!" was my cry. "What for? Are you hurt? Have you seen something?" again demanded Bessie. "Oh, I saw a light, and I thought a ghost would come." I had now got hold of Bessie's hand, and she did not snatch it from me. She has screamed out on purpose," declared Abbot in some disgust. "And what a scream! If she had been in great pain, one would have excused it. But she only wanted to bring us all here. I know her naughty tricks." "What's all this?" demanded another voice peremptorily, and Mrs. Reed came along the corridor, her cap flying wide, her gown rustling stormily. "Abbot and Bessie, I believe I gave orders that Jane Eyre should be left in the Red Room till I came to her myself." "Miss Jane screams so loud, ma'am," pleaded Bessie. "Let her go," was the only answer. "Loose Bessie's hand, child. You cannot succeed in getting out by these means, be assured. I abhorred artifice, particularly in children. It is my duty to show you that tricks will not answer. You will now stay there an hour longer, and it is only on condition of perfect submission and stillness that I shall liberate you then. Oh, aunt, have pity! Forgive me! I cannot endure it! Let me be punished some other way! I shall be killed! Silence! This violence is almost repulsive. And so, no doubt, she felt it, as a precocious actress in her eyes. She sincerely looked on me as a compound of virulent passions, mean spirit, and dangerous duplicity. Bessie and Abbot having retreated, Mrs. Reed, impatient of my now frantic anguish and wild sobs, abruptly thrust me back and locked me in, without further parley. I heard her sweeping away, and soon after she was gone, I suppose I had a species of fit. Unconsciousness closed the scene. End of chapter. Yeah, man, that lady, oh my goodness. Mrs. Reed. That was really mean. She's a child. She was crying and she dares to believe that she was acting. Like, honestly, the audacity. The audacity. Oh, man. So, let me see. I think I'm going to read another chapter. Just, let me see. What do you... Probably, for those of you who are here, let me know what you guys think. Or if you're watching on the rewatch, let me know what you think about this. I've always thought that it was really well written, how like her terror, like she like incrementally added on to like how her psychological and emotional state just started to like escalate. So first she was just angry, rebellious, she was not afraid. But then again, as nighttime started and the room got darker, and she began to, you know, all of her angerness kind of like went away, and she began to feel very sorry indeed that she had acted like that. And now we get a little bit of backstory too. We get the story of how she ends up in Gateshead House. So her aunt is her aunt by marriage. So her uncle, the uncle that married the aunt, he's dead. And he was the brother of Jane Eyre's mother. So it seems that he was taking care of her. He was actually like a very good man, apparently, because he made sure to take her in when the mother and her parents died. And then as he was dying, he made sure to get a promise from his wife that he would take care of her. Now, when he died, Jane was 1 year old. So we don't, like, this is all just stories of, like, this is what she has heard about his death. So yeah, and the fact that they locked her in the room where he died, even though he's supposed to have been supposedly a good man, she doesn't want him to show up because just anything that's like dealing with the supernatural would frighten her. And so we get here like how, looking back, she has, it's like she has been able to think over her childhood experiences. And I find it really interesting how she's like, yeah, looking back, I can see why I was like, I was probably an uncanny kind of child, and I see where they're coming from, where they found me kind of scary maybe, or just unnatural. She was not she was not like a gay, happy child. She was quiet, reserved. She was didn't really, she said people would have enjoyed it if she had been pleasing to them, if she had tried to ingratiate herself with people, but she didn't. So it was just not in her temperament, and just her temperament itself did not go with anybody there. So unfortunately, that was how she was as a child. And yeah. Okay, Little Butterfly says, I have seen parts of the 2006 adaptation. I Actually, the 2006 adaptation is one of my favorites, though it's not perfect. There are some things I wish they had done differently. So, I mean, it is good. So there's no perfect adaptation. I think the one that's most faithful is the 1983 one. I think Timothy Dalton. Let me just check. Timothy Dalton. Yeah, I think, yeah, Timothy Dalton, who, British actor. He portrayed James Bond in, like, he did some of the James Bond movies. He was Rochester. So yeah. So anyway, that's the version that, in my opinion, is the most faithful. It is a mini series, like I think it's like 10 episodes, or it's high up there in the numbers, but it's really well done in my opinion. And of course, not perfect. And again, if you want atmospheric, kind of like just like angst and all the things, my favorite soundtrack probably is the one from the 2011 version, and that's a good adaptation. But again, between them all, I think the one that I like the most is the 2006 version, just because I think the leads had really good chemistry, and I'm a Toby I'm a Toby fan, so there we go. All right, so yeah, let's see. So, hi, Remy says, oh no, did I come too late? Are we ending? No, we're not ending. I'm going to read another chapter, so don't worry. So far, though, we're just getting to know Jane. She is, TLDR, if you just got here, Jane is, and if you haven't read the book, probably you are, but just in case, Jane is an orphan. She lives with her relatives, specifically an aunt, who apparently does not love her. She suffers bullying from her older cousin and general neglect and loneliness. And so one day she absolutely snaps. She had been an obedient kind of child, but she one day snaps and fights back against her bully, which earns her a punishment. She is locked in the Red Room, which is basically like a room that's never used. But that's the room where her uncle died. So she is locked there. She experiences like a mental breakdown almost, and that's where we ended. Basically, we're just learning about her growing up. Vincent says, I have never seen an adaptation, I think. Okay, no worries. We can watch one day. And then Red Tempest says, so she has no adult blood relatives, only a spiteful aunt. Yes, that is right. She's basically alone in the world. The Abbott said that if it weren't for her aunt, she would be thrown into the poorhouse. So the poorhouse were like basically where all the homeless people are supposed to go. So in this era, you guys, being homeless was a crime. I mean, it's kind of like the same way. Okay, being homeless was a crime. So if you were caught vagrancy, there were vagrancy laws. If you were just out and about, living, I don't know, under the bridge or loitering about, they could put you in jail. Now, where did the people that had no house, had no family, that were poor, where did they end up? Basically the poorhouse. There was these quote-unquote charitable institutions. But basically it's just another prison, and the conditions were terrible. Children often died from disease. It was just no good. So basically, to throw a child to the poorhouse was basically condemning them to abject penury, like just poorness, probably early death, tuberculosis, I don't know, just all the miseries of the day were at the poorhouse. If you want some more of that, do read Charles Dickens, specifically Oliver Twist. We get him at the poorhouse. We get a vivid depiction of poorhouse life. So yeah, very terrible time. All right, so this one should also be in the Gutenberg Project website. Yes, indeed. Though, Crusher, I actually got this from the Google Play Bookstore. So if you go to Google Play Bookstore and just look Jane Eyre and filter through and just get the free ones, they have them. So I'm reading from that one. I didn't have to get it from the online books page, but you can check it out there, because they also have there in their website, they have versions that have illustrations on it. This one is not illustrated, but I think there might be some that are illustrated. But they're like web pages, so they're not like downloadable. I don't know. I haven't really checked. I'll check afterwards. So yeah. Oh, you guys, here's another. This is Jane Eyre from 1943, which I forgot. A very good one too. It's well, okay. So which one of this do you think is Jane Eyre? Of course, it's the one in the left. But check this out. Do you guys recognize who this child in the left is? I mean, on the right is? Yes, that is right. That is Elizabeth Taylor. The Elizabeth Taylor. She played Helen in this adaptation. So yeah, it's also a good one. I think it's Joan Fontaine was Jane Eyre for this one. And what's his name? What is his name? He was a very famous actor. Joan Fontaine and I forget his name. He was Rochester. But yeah, it's a good one. So these are good ones. Like I haven't the 1943 version is good. The 1983 version is good. Also, here's again Jane in the Red Room. This is right after she was knocked down. Poor darling. This is the 1996 version. It's okay too, I guess. Maybe we will get some of the into this part. And then 2006, also good. And then again, a really good one though, 2011. Very good adaptation as well. All of them are excellent. So, okay. So it says, Crusher, I might just buy the physical copy. Do, it's a very good book. It's a very good addition to your library. I'm glad that you're enjoying it so far. That tells me that you're enjoying it so far. So do so. There's many beautiful versions out there. They have, so just take your pick. There's illustrated versions. There's versions with notes in it. Oh, so many good stuff. All right, so one more chapter, you guys, because let's see. Oh, hold on, wrong view. Okay, so probably we won't get to the part I wanted to end. I wanted to get to the part where she meets Mr. Brocklehurst, but probably that will take me a little bit longer. Oh, that's chapter 4. And we're already an hour into the read along. I'll just do one chapter and then we'll do the meeting with Mr. Brocklehurst next time. Something to look forward to, I think. By the way, welcome Akihana. Woke up at 4 a.m. for some water and potty. Well, I'm glad that you have joined us. If you're gonna go back to bed, I hope the voice just suits you and you can watch the entire thing later on. Glad to have you here, Akihana. Yeah, you should go to sleep. Definitely. But thank you for joining us. All right, let's return. Chapter 3. The next thing I remember is waking up with a feeling as if I had had a frightful nightmare and seeing before me a terrible red glare crossed with thick black bars. I heard voices too, speaking with a hollow sound, and as if muffled by a rush of wind or water. Agitation, uncertainty, and an all-predominating sense of terror confused my faculties. Ere long, I became aware that someone was handling me, lifting me up and supporting me in a sitting posture, and that more tenderly than I had ever been raised or upheld before. I rested my head against a pillow or an arm and felt easy. In 5 minutes more, the cloud of bewilderment dissolved. I knew quite well that I was in my own bed, and that the red glare was the nursery fire. It was night. A candle burnt on the table. Bessie stood at the bed foot with a basin in her hand, and a gentleman sat in a chair near my pillow, leaning over me. I felt an inexpressible relief, a soothing conviction of protection and security, when I knew that there was a stranger in the room, an individual not belonging to Gateshead, and not related to Mrs. Reed. Turning from Bessie, though her presence was far less obnoxious to me than that of Abbot, for instance, would have been, I scrutinized the face of the gentleman. I knew him. He was Mr. Lloyd, an apothecary, sometimes called in by Mrs. Reed when the servants were ailing. For herself and the children, she employed a physician. Oh, uh, well, who am I? He asked. I pronounced his name, offering him at the same time my hand. He took it, smiling and saying, "We shall do very well by and by." Then he laid me down and addressing Bessie, charged her to be very careful that I was not disturbed during the night. Having given some further directions and intimates that he should call again the next day, he departed. To my grief, I felt so sheltered and befriended while he sat in the chair near my pillow. And as he closed the door after him, all the room darkened and my heart sank again. Inexpressible sadness weighted it down. "Do you feel as if you should sleep, miss?" asked Bessie rather softly. Scarcely dared I answer her, for I feared the next sentence might be rough. "I will try." "Would you like to drink, or could you eat anything?" "No, thank you, Bessie." "Then I think I shall go to bed, for it is past 12 o'clock, but you may call me if you want anything in the night." Wonderful civility, this! It emboldened me to ask a question. "Bessie, what is the matter with me? Am I ill?" "You fell sick, I suppose, in the red room with crying. You'll be better soon, no doubt." Bessie went into the housemaid's apartment, which was near. I heard her say, "Sarah, come and sleep with me in the nursery. I daren't for my life be alone with that poor child tonight. She might die. It is such a strange thing she should have that fit. I wonder if she saw anything. Mrs. was rather too hard." Sarah came back with her. They both went to bed. They were whispering together for half an hour before they fell asleep. I caught scraps of their conversation from which I was able only too distinctly to infer the main subject discussed. Something passed her, all dressed in white, and vanished. A great black dog behind him. 3 loud raps on the chamber door. A light in the churchyard just over his grave, etc., etc., etc. They're talking about horror stories. Also, you guys, notice that they sent for the apothecary for Jane instead of the physician. The apothecary is for the servants, so she doesn't consider Jane as like family. She has relegated her to servant or below. That's the level that she considers her at. So yeah, very, very subtle way of doing things, Mrs. Reed. At last both slept. The fire and the candle went out. For me, the watches of that long night passed in ghastly wakefulness, strained by dread, such dread as children only can feel. No severe or prolonged bodily illness followed this incident of the Red Room. It only gave my nerves a shock of which I felt the reverberation to this day. Yes, Mrs. Reed, to you I owe some fearful pangs of mental suffering. But I ought to forgive you, for you knew not what you did. While rending my heartstrings, you thought you were only uprooting my bad propensities. Next day, by noon, I was up and dressed, and sat wrapped in a shawl by the nursery hearth. I felt physically weak and broken down, but my worst ailment was an unutterable wretchedness of mind, a wretchedness which kept drawing from me silent tears. No, sudden, no, no sooner had I wiped no sooner had I wiped one salt drop from my cheek than another followed. Yet, I thought, I ought to have been happy, for none of the Reeds were there. They were all gone out in the carriage with their mamma. Abbot, too, was sewing in another room, and Bessie, as she moved hither and thither, putting away toys and arranging drawers, addressed to me every now and then a word of unwonted kindness. This state of things should have been a paradise for me, a paradise of peace, accustomed as I was to a life of ceaseless reprimand and thankless fagging. But in fact my racked nerves were now in such a state that no calm could soothe and no pleasure excite them agreeably. Bessie had been down into the kitchen, and she brought up with her a tart on a certain brightly painted china plate, whose birds of paradise, nestling in a wreath of convolvuli, convolvuli and rosebuds, had been wont to stir me in the most enthusiastic sense of admiration, and which plate I had often petitioned to be allowed to take in my hand in order to examine it more closely, but had always hitherto, but had always hit, but had always hitherto been deemed unworthy of such a privilege. This precious vessel was now placed on my knee, and I was cordially invited to eat the circlet of delicate pastry upon it. Vain favor, coming, like most other favors, long deferred and often wished for, too late. I could not eat the tart, and the plumage of the bird, the tints of the flowers seemed strangely faded. I put both plate and tart away. Bessie asked if I would have a book. The word book acted as a transient stimulus, and I begged her to fetch Gulliver's Travels from the library. This book I had again and again perused with delight. I considered it a narrative of facts, and discovered in it a vein of interest deeper than what I had found in fairy tales. For as to the elves, having sought them in vain among foxglove leaves and bells, under mushrooms and beneath the ground ivy, mantling old walnuts, I had at length made up my mind to the sad truth. They were all gone out of England to some savage country where the woods were wilder and thicker, and the population more scant, whereas Lilliput and Brobdingnag, Broad, Brobding, Brobdingnag, man, I read that book and I still can't say it. Whereas Lilliput and Brobdingnag being in my creed solid parts of the earth's surface, I doubted not that I might one day, by taking a long voyage, see with my own eyes the little fields, houses, and trees, the diminutive people, the tiny cows, sheep, and birds of the one realm, and the cornfields forest high, the mighty mastiffs, the monster cats, the tower-like men and women of the other. Yet, when this cherished volume was now placed in my hand, when I turned over its leaves and sought in its marvelous pictures the charm I had, till now, never failed to find, all was eerie and dreary. The giants were gaunt goblins, the pygmies malevolent and fearful imps, Gulliver a most desolate wanderer in most dread and dangerous regions. I closed the book, which I dared no longer peruse, and put it on the table beside the untasted tart. Bessie had now finished dusting and tidying the room, and having washed her hands, she opened a certain little drawer, full of splendid shreds of silk and satin, and began making a new bonnet for Georgiana's doll. Meanwhile she sang. The song was, "In the days when we went gypsying, a long time ago." I had often heard the song before, and always with lively delight, for Bessie had a sweet voice, at least I thought so. But now, though her voice was still sweet, I found in its melancholy and I found in its melody an indescribable sadness. Sometimes preoccupied with her work, she sang the refrain very low, very lingeringly. A long time ago came out like the saddest cadence of a funeral hymn. She passed into another ballad, this time a really doleful one. My feet they are sore, and my limbs they are weary. Long is the way, and the mountains are wild. Soon will the twilight close, moonless and dreary, over the path of the poor orphan child. Why did they send me so far and so lonely, up where the moors spread and grey rocks are piled? Men are hard-hearted, and kind angels only watch over the steps of a poor orphan child. Yet distant and soft the night breeze is blowing, clouds there are none, and clear stars beam mild. God in his mercy protection is showing, comfort and hope to the poor orphan child. E'en should I fall o'er the broken bridge passing, or stray in the marshes by false light beguiled, still will my Father, with promise and blessing, take to his bosom the poor orphan child. There is a thought that for strength should avail me, thought both of shelter and kindred despoiled. Heaven is a home, and a rest will not fail me. God is a friend to the poor orphan child. Come, Miss Jane, don't cry, said Bessie as she finished. She might as well have said to the fire, don't burn. But how could she divine the morbid suffering to which I was a prey? In the course of the morning, Mr. Lloyd came again. What, already up? Said he, as he entered the nursery. Well, nurse, how is she? Bessie answered that I was doing very well. Then she ought to look more cheerful. Come here, Miss Jane. Your name is Jane, is it not? Yes, sir. Jane Eyre. Well, you have been crying, Miss Jane Eyre. Can you tell me what about? Have you any pain? No, sir. Oh, I dare say she's... Oh, this is Bessie. Oh, I dare say she's crying because she could not go out with Mrs. in the carriage, interposed Bessie. Surely not. Why, she is too old for such pettishness. I thought so too, and my self-esteem being wounded by the false charge, I answered promptly, I never cried for such a thing in my life. I hate going out in the carriage. I cry because I am miserable. Oh, fie, miss, said Bessie. The good apothecary appeared a little puzzled. I was standing before him. He fixed his eyes on me very steadily. His eyes were small and grey, not very bright, but I dare say I should think them shrewd now. He had a hard-featured yet good-natured-looking face. Having considered me at leisure, he said, What made you ill yesterday? She had a fall, said Bessie, again putting in her word. Fall? Why, that is like a baby again. Can't she manage to walk at her age? She must be 8 or 9 years old. I was knocked down, was a blunt explanation, jerked out of me by another pang of mortified pride. But that did not make me ill, I added, while Mr. Lloyd helped himself to a pinch of snuff. As he was returning the box to his waistcoat pocket, a loud bell rang for the servants' dinner. He knew what it was. That's for you, nurse, said he. You can go down. I'll give Miss Jane a lecture till you come back. Bessie would rather have stayed, but she was obliged to go because punctuality at meals was rigidly enforced at Gateshead Hall. The fall did not make you ill. What did then? Pursued Mr. Lloyd when Bessie was gone. I was shut up in a room where there's a ghost till after dark. I saw Mr. Lloyd smile and frown at the same time. Ghost? What? You are a baby after all. You're afraid of ghosts? Of Mr. Reed's ghost I am. He died in that room and was laid out there. Neither Bessie nor anyone else will go into it at night if they can help it, and it was cruel to shut me up alone without a candle. So cruel that I think I shall never forget it. Nonsense! And is this what makes you so miserable? Are you afraid now in daylight? No, but night will come again before long. And besides, I am unhappy, very unhappy, for other things. What other things? Can you tell me some of them? How much I wished to reply fully to this question. How difficult it was to frame any answer. Children can feel, but they cannot analyze their feelings, and if the paralysis is partially affected in thought, they know not how to express the result of the process in words. Fearful, however, of losing this first and only opportunity of relieving my grief by imparting it, I, after a disturbed pause, contrived to frame a meagre, though, as far as it went, true response. For one thing, I have no father or mother, brothers or sisters. You have a kind aunt and cousins. Again I paused, then bunglingly announced, But John Reed knocked me down, and my aunt shut me up in the red room. Mr. Lloyd a second time produced his snuff-box. Don't you think Gateshead Hall a very beautiful house? Asked he. Are you not very thankful to have such a fine place to live at? It is not my house, sir, and Abbot says I have less right to be in here than a servant. Pooh! You can't be silly enough to wish to leave such a splendid place. If I had anywhere else to go, I should be glad to leave it, but I can never get away from Gateshead till I am a woman. Perhaps you may. Who knows? Have you any relations besides Mrs. Reed? I think not, sir. None belonging to your father? I don't know. I asked Aunt Reed once, and she said possibly I might have some poor, low relations called Eyre, but she knew nothing about them. If you had such, would you like to go to them? I reflected. Poverty looks grim to grown people, still more so to children. They have not much idea of industrious, working, respectable poverty. They think of the word only as connected with ragged clothes, scanty food, fireless grates, rude manners, and debasing vices. Poverty, for me, was synonymous with degradation. No, I should not like to belong to poor people, was my reply. Not even if they were kind to you. I shook my head. I could not see how poor people had the means of being kind. And then to learn to speak like them, to adopt their manners, to be uneducated, to grow up like one of the poor women I saw sometimes nursing their children or washing their clothes at the cottage doors of the village of Gateshead. No, I was not heroic enough to purchase liberty at the price of caste. But are your relatives so very poor? Are they working people? I cannot tell. Aunt Reed says if I have any, they must be a beggarly set. I should not like to go a begging. Would you like to go to school? Again, I reflected. I scarcely knew what school was. Bessie sometimes spoke of it as a place where young ladies sat in the stocks, wore backboards, and were expected to be exceedingly genteel and precise. John Reed hated his school and abused his master, but John Reed's tastes were no rule for mine. And if Bessie accounts of school discipline, gathered from the young ladies of a family where she had lived before coming to Gateshead, were somewhat appalling, her details of certain accomplishments attained by these same young ladies were, I thought, equally attractive. She boasted of beautiful paintings of landscapes and flowers by them executed, of songs they could sing and pieces they could play, of purses they could knit, of French books they could translate, till my spirit was moved to emulation as I listened. Besides, school would be a complete change. It implied a long journey, an entire separation from Gateshead, an entrance into a new life. I should indeed like to go to school, was the audible conclusion of my musings. Well, well, who knows what may happen, said Mr. Lloyd as he got up. The child ought to have a change of air and scene, he added, speaking to himself, nerves not in a good state. Bessie now returned. At the same moment the carriage was heard rolling up the gravel walk. Is that your mistress, nurse? Asked Mr. Lloyd. I should like to speak to her before I go. Bessie invited him to walk into the breakfast room and led the way out. In the interview which followed between him and Mrs. Reed, I presume, from after occurrences, that the apothecary ventured to recommend my being sent to school, and the recommendation was no doubt readily enough adopted. For as Abbot said in discussing the subject with Bessie, when both sat sewing in the nursery one night after I was in bed, and, as I thought, asleep, Mrs. was, she dared say, glad enough to be rid of such a tiresome, ill-conditioned child who always looked as if she were watching everybody and scheming plots underhand. Abbot, I think, gave me credit for being a sort of infantine Guy Fawkes. On that same occasion, I learned for the first time, from Mrs. Abbott's communications to Bessie, that my father had been a poor clergyman, that my mother had married him against the wishes of her friends, who considered the match beneath her, that my grandfather Reed was so irritated at her disobedience he'd cut her off without a shilling, that after my mother and father had been married a year, the latter caught the typhus fever while visiting among the poor of a large manufacturing town where his curacy was situated, and where that disease was then prevalent, that my mother took the infection from him, and both died within a month of each other. Bessie, when she heard this narrative, sighed and said, Poor Miss Jane is to be pitied too, Abbot. Yes, responded Abbot, if she were a nice, pretty child, one might compassionate her forlornness. But she really cannot care. But one really cannot care for such a little toad as that. Not a great deal, to be sure, agreed Bessie. At any rate, a beauty like Miss Georgiana would be more moving in the same condition. Yes, I dote on Miss Georgiana, cried the fervent Abbot. Little darling, with her long curls and her blue eyes, and such a sweet color as she has, just as if she were painted. Bessie, I could fancy a Welsh rabbit for supper. So could I, with a roast onion. Come, we'll go down. They went. End of chapter. All right, you guys, I am going to stop here. So, it seems that whatever influence the apothecary had, it has been exerted, and now she is off to school. Wow. Let's see how that goes for her. I hope we wish her all the best. Yeah. So I hope that you guys can join me for the next one. Just want to say a quick hello to those peeps that joined us on the live. And Red Tempest, Crusher, Little Butterfly, Akihana, Hi Remy, Vincent, all of you. Oh, Noodle Dumplings Kimchi. Thank you for joining me today. Yes, Jane gets to go to school, and it's the beginning of her story, I guess. Who knows what she'll experience? Again, all that she knows about school is one that well, she knows from John about school, but she doesn't have a high opinion of what he thinks about school. He thinks school sucks, but she's like, yeah, I wouldn't rely on his opinion for anything, least of all school. Now, Bessie, though, she says that school is a place where they punish you, like lots of discipline, like even corporal punishment. Like they would stick a board in your back to make sure that you stand straight. So that's like very like strict disciplinarian kind of attitude towards education. But that was bad. But Jane thinks, that discipline renders somebody able to speak French, to do these things, to be able to paint, to be able to do music, to to have these skills. And she's like, I could put up with those disciplines, if there's such a thing as those kinds of disciplines, if I can get out of here, first of all, and learn something. So we know for sure that that she's not averse to discipline, as long as she can learn. However, discipline is different from cruelty. So back in the day, discipline bordered on the cruel, if I may say so. So also, one other thing we also get in this chapter, we get Bessie and Abbott talking about her past, in which we learn a little bit more about her parents. Again, we had already seen that Mr. Reed, her uncle who died, was the brother of Jane Eyre's mother. Yeah. So now we know that Jane's mother was, I guess she was like they had money. She came from a wealthy family. And so she decided to marry her, like a poor curate, which earned her father's discontent and anger. He cast her out without a penny, so they lived very poor lives. And into their marriage, not long into their marriage, they had Jane, and then her father got sick of typhus fever. Her mother followed soon after, and so that's where she ended up being taken in by her uncle. I'm sure her uncle sympathized with his sister. I'm sure that he believed that their father had been very cruel in the way they had just cast her out. So this was the least he could do, I suppose. Yeah. Red Tempest asks, will she start having gremlin antics? LOL. We'll see. We will see. Right now she's coming into her own. Remember, she was very meek before. Right now she's at that point in time where she's kind of like in between childhood and kind of, I think though, you guys, that this is the end of her childhood. Remember, she was given all the things that she had longed for before. Like Abbott gave her a little plate with a little pastry in it. Before, she used to love it. She used to yearn to hold the plate. And now that she has it, she's like, this is no big deal. It's kind of like tawdry and faded. I don't like it. So she put it aside. Then at the thought of books, she immediately was like, I want Gulliver's Travels. But now that she looks at the books, she sees it for like what it is, or it has a negative connotation. So Yeah, a part of Jane's childhood has died with her in the Red Room, and with the attack with that episode in the Red Room definitely did take a big blow to her. Just her childhood, her innocence. She's now more she's more melancholic right now, especially because she feels that she doesn't have a friend in the world. So yeah, I guess she has lost hope that one day her aunt would accept her. I think that was she always obeyed in part because of fear, but I also think in hopes that maybe her aunt would accept her. At one point, her aunt, remember, said at the beginning, "I will not welcome you into my family circle until you become a more genial, more kind, more cheerful kind of child." And in a way, she was trying to live up to that expectation, but I think she's given up by now. And especially with the treatment that she received from her aunt and locking her into the Red Room. And one more thing, it's sad that we get a lot of information about the Jane Eyre's family on the side of her father. All we know is that he was a poor curate, but we don't know if he has other brothers, cousins, a sister. We don't know anything more. So she could have probably been sent out to another family member and maybe suffered less. But the woman didn't either didn't want to or didn't bother to look for them, or maybe, I have a feeling though that she was just like being malicious, like just to spread contempt. Just said that they were like poor as paupers, like they were like on the verge of being like beggars. I think that's just meanness and spite on her side. Because even in this era, being a curate, it still had you not quite. It was still part of the gentry, not quite like a gentleman, whereas you didn't have to work to get to live on. You basically lived on investments and the interest accrued from that, from your investments. So society back in the day, we had the people with titles: lords, ladies, barons, dukes. Then you had the gentry. The gentry being like people who are like wealthy, and they can live on. They don't have to work for a living. They just spend their days off, like Mrs. Reed. So this Mrs. Reed, her family, her husband, gentry. Jane Eyre's mother came from gentry, so they were wealthy people. And then you have regular folks. You have the merchants, the lawyer. And hold on. Between in the gentry, there's the clerics, so the parishioners, the pastors, I guess the people that led the church, all that stuff. They were also considered gentry, so they were still like up there in the society status. So even a poor curate would still be up there, like still considered like a level above lawyers, merchants, booksellers, bakers. After the gentry, there was that just people who are like work for their living. So when it never occurred to Jane Eyre that there's a huge there's a huge amount of society that she doesn't know, just the respectable everyday folk who do work 9 to 5 and live. And possibly if she had learned more about this, she would have considered that maybe her father from the her father's side of the family might be maybe not gentry, but maybe they weren't as bad off as she thought they were, because she thought that they were beggars in the street. That's really mean. So yeah, I feel sorry for our girl. So she has chosen, and she has spoken up. She has decided that she wants to go to school, and she is getting what she wants. So we'll see about the gremlin antics. We already had her do a gremlin antic. She fought back against John, and I think that got her into trouble. So she probably is going to be a bit more careful about going on a rampage. Hi, Remy says, I knew nothing of Jane Eyre. I'm excited for the next session. I'm so glad. Yes, do enjoy it. It has a very interesting story. So again, this is all the author or the narrator is Jane Eyre herself, looking back after many years, having grown up, having overcome all the trials and tribulations. She's basically done her whole journey. So this is considered a Bildungsroman. I think that's what they call it. Basically a coming of age story. So it has a beginning where she's just lacking in everything, doesn't have family, doesn't have affection, doesn't have the independence, and just her story of how she grows up and is able to overcome many of the trials that come her way. And you'll be surprised where it all ends up and where she ends up. All right. So yeah, I hope you join me on the next one. Hi, Remy. And Teal says, I was here. I was going to stay caught up on this one. Really enjoying it so far. Hey, welcome, Teal. I'm glad that you are here. Yes, welcome to our little group. Okay, and then Hi Remy says, let's not get our hopes up at Red Tempest, but if she does, then I'll be happy to accompany her story even more. Red Tempest. So you'll be surprised at Jane Eyre. Maybe not quite Rosamund Gremlin rampage levels, but this girl has shown a bit of spunk in fighting back. It was there dormant, and it got out for a second, and she fought back against John. It got her into trouble, but she's developing a consciousness of like she's developing some spunk. Like, I promise you, like she's not a pushover. That much I can tell you. She's not a pushover, and that's what I love about this story a lot. So yes, join me for the next one, you guys. I think it's we got Jane going into school, and I think it's something that you will find interesting. I'm not saying more, but she will go to school, and we'll see how she likes it, who she meets, and let's see how school goes with her. Does it agree with her, or is it just no good? Does it meet her expectations? We'll see. Not Hartmut or Clarissa level either. Nobody can be like Hartmut and Clarissa except Hartmut and Clarissa. I'm sorry to say. Jane Eyre is just being herself. I think you'll love her for being herself. I think you will. All right, you guys, thank you for joining me. We went a little long, an hour and a half, but just because this is the very first session, I figured it was okay. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one. I'll try to do on the weekend, maybe on a Sunday. If not, we'll see you on a Monday. All right? Remember to subscribe and like and comment and share and all the things. And I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.